Africa.
I'll keep myself.
You can't change the temp. You can't change the temp.
Can you turn it? Yes.
Yeah, I think it's
Temporarily, we just exchange for temporarily.
Yeah. No, before we start, that special issue we're working on should come out soon.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it should come out soon.
I sent you a draft introduction. You never told me whether you saw it or not.
Oh no, I did. I'm sorry. I just because we're working under pressure, I checked it, then I dispatched it.
Okay, that's
so
great.
It's all accepted now. They are just doing the technical things.
That's great. That's great. Looking forward to that one.
Yeah. I think maybe we should give it about 5 minutes or so, then we start.
Yes,
to allow
please.
other people to come in.
I saw the speaker is already around.
Yeah. Maybe we should just allow other people to come in, maybe 5 minutes, then we can start.
Yeah. There might be some who were confused a bit by the times. I was nearly confused myself.
Yes. Okay, now I'll start shortly.
So.
Did you travel home safe last night?
Oh yeah. Just hit the bed.
Yeah.
You must have got home late.
Yeah, but we are hungry, so we went to eat.
Where did you eat?
We had the famous Bayreuth dinner.
Bayreuth dinner. Yeah, well, I thought you would have had what did they call it? So one day I
the Bratwurst.
No, what do you call it? Schofler. Schofler. The shoulder of the pig.
You're speaking to the Zoom people.
Oh, right, okay. But I'm not saying anything.
It's just that you're aware.
Yeah.
And the session is recorded as well.
Oh no!
A good first impression.
I think we will start at around the 10 past 3 minutes now from now.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think maybe some people misunderstood that it is not the Knowledge Lab link, but the link that people will get when registering. Possibly it was not quite clear, and I just sent a message to the fellows who were not able to enter. But so it will take a couple of minutes to them to join us.
So you mean we need to give them maybe 2 more minutes?
Yes.
Okay.
If it's possible, I don't know. Is Akusua in the Zoom already?
I think I saw the name somewhere in the list on the chat, on the participants.
No, she's logged in.
I want to hide everything that's untidy for them. Television.
can speak freely now because recording has been paused. It's really a kind of Big Brother setting.
Yeah.
It's been quite a
Oh, Liz has joined. Oh, hello, Liz.
Fences,
Yeah.
speaking.
And podcast yesterday.
Okay.
There was a recording for a podcast yesterday for about 15 minutes.
I think I need to check my manuals.
Hi, Bongani, maybe we can begin.
One sheet, please.
The speaker is saying is ready, so we can begin. Maybe let me do my quick opening remarks, then we begin. I hope everyone hears me very clearly. My name is Sabelo Jaindo Vukacheni, and it is my great pleasure and indeed honor to welcome you to this 8th and the last seminar in the series of our monthly seminars on the theme of the changing African idea of Africa and the future of African studies for this year, 2022. Briefly, this is a collaborative project that my chair at this University of Bayreuth and the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study began at the beginning of the year. And we are happy to report that in 2023, we'll be joined by the Council for the Development of Social Science Research, CODESRIA, in co-hosting these seminars. It is also part of our Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence, whose mandate is to advance the agenda of reconfiguring African studies. And as such, the seminars are part of our regular Knowledge Lab keynote events organized around the questions of methodology, theory, and reflexive African studies. Today, we're very excited and delighted to have Professor Akosoa Atamoko Ampofu delivering the 8th seminar in our series. Professor Ampofu is a well-known scholar whom I won't take too long to introduce. She is currently Professor of Gender and African Studies at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana in Legon. If I can use the word veteran, I think Professor Ampofu is a veteran who had held various prestigious fellowships and a leadership position in academia, and these include being a fellow of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Social Science, president of the African Studies Association of Africa, editor-in-chief of the Contemporary Journal of African Studies, and here at Bayreuth, she is not a stranger to us, as she is the chair of the board of the Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence. She has published extensively on various aspects of gender, feminism, and African studies, and the latest major publication is a co-edited book entitled Producing Inclusive Feminist Knowledge, Positionalities and Discourses in the Global South. And today, her presentation is entitled African Citizenship and the Ownership of Material and Intellectual Cultures. And we will give Professor Ampofu 60 minutes to deliver her, her presentation. And after that, my colleague, Dr. Bongani Ngulunga, will take over to chair the Q&A. It's over to you, Professor Akosoa Ampofu. We are very excited to host you today, and you are welcome.
As usual, my mic was muted, so I've just come down there. So you didn't hear my thanks. So thanks to Professor Dr. Sabelo Ndlovu Gacheni again. Henceforth, I will just refer to you as Sabelo.
Yes, please.
For inviting me to participate in this series on epistemologies of the Global South. I'm really excited to be doing that. And thanks to the entire team at Uni Bayreuth and at the Johannesburg Institute for making this series happen. I know there's a lot of background work that goes on that we often don't see. When I accepted to do this and chose the last date, I thought I was being strategic. It ends up that my predecessors have done such an excellent job that I was just thinking, over the last couple of days, what on earth could I possibly add to this? But I hope that my reflections will enable us to have a conversation, and that when we open for the Q&A, it will not just be, I'm the keynote speaker, I've made a presentation, I'm responding, that the commentary, it will be a conversation amongst us, and that others will feel free to answer any questions that are fielded. Sabelo, I was first introduced to your work via Codesria, and we finally met in person in 2019 at a conference on African Studies. I'm quoting now, African Studies, Decoloniality, Decolonization and the Academy, that was held at the University of Wisconsin. This was in 2019. At that meeting, you spoke on your work, and then I made a presentation that was titled Cross-Examining African-Centeredness Debates, Acute on Chronic, in which I sought to show, among other things, some of the challenges we face in our approaches to the quote-unquote decolonize agenda. We have been buffeted from so many sides for so long that we often find ourselves addressing acute situations, right? Police brutality, changing names of buildings, our curricula, blah, blah, and, on it goes, because, it's just coming at us one after the other, and we are often in response mode, while the deep-seated chronic issues don't get as much attention as they need because we're simply exhausted, drained, and sometimes we're just sad, right? So, and the past few years have been especially difficult as we, and by we, I mean people of Africa on the continent and in the diaspora, we've experienced the effects of COVID-19 in very particular ways, including COVID-related borders, both the physical borders, but also the borders around the science and the vaccine and the knowledge that has been coming from the continent on COVID-19. So it's a particular moment that we find ourselves in. And I'll return to that at the end in terms of what it means for us for healing and for working together and moving forward. So the term epistemologies of the Global South suggests something. In 2014, I was invited by the Consortium of Humanity Centers and Institutes to a special meeting on African humanities, and it was held in Stellenbosch in South Africa. I was on a panel titled Theory from the South Revisited, and I have been invited to respond to the Komarov text by that name. By now, most of us are intensely aware of the fact that our citation practices are a deeply political act, right? Who you cite is very important to what you're trying to do and what you're trying to say. And so one of the first things I did when I received a copy of the book was to check the reference list. Disappointingly, most of my favorite scholars, let alone, ancestors, were missing. When so many months ago, I offered the title of this talk, I intended to talk about issues of ownership, power, how one situates oneself, stepping forward or stepping back, depending on who you are and the context and the moment. When it comes to knowledge about global Africa, this was my intent. And, as I said, a lot of this ground has been covered in different ways. And I see I haven't been able to attend all the talks, but I see both from those that I have attended and from, the topics and the abstracts, that clearly we have been in conversation with each other, even though we haven't necessarily been in conversation with each other on Zoom. And I'm almost certain that this afternoon I am largely in the company of the faithful, kindred spirits with a similar agenda. So I have to alert you that I'm not likely to say anything that is earth-shattering. And yet I believe that emphasizing some of the actions towards reclaiming our citizenship might encourage us forward, because we're certainly in this moment where we need constant encouragement, constant revitalization, constant reassurances of the fact that the work that we are doing is important. So what I'd like to do today is share some scattered reflections and engage us in a quote unquote how-to conversation. How can we move forward in our work of owning what is ours, benefiting from our material intellectual culture, spiritually, emotionally, and financially? So I'll do the following. I will very briefly offer some examples of ways in which this citizenship, as I will briefly explain shortly, has been stripped when it comes to these cultures of ours, especially knowledge, and describe some examples of the ways that it is being addressed and propose how we might expand on those. So I've set myself what I hope is a very simple agenda, and I invite you to be in conversation with me. Before I begin, this is something I have been doing in the last few years, and may I just crave your indulgence for us to hold a moment's silence for all those who have preceded us to join the ancestors in the work that we do. Thank you very much. So we live in an age where epistemologies are under attack. Nothing seems to be sacred, perhaps. And maybe this is good, as it allows us to become unfettered from our traditions. You know, some of these traditions, important as they are, prevent us sometimes from dreaming and from discovering. And so, you know, attacking certain orthodoxies may have a certain value. At the same time, it seems to me that we are creating new orthodoxies and, you know, reinventing certain traditions, just putting old wine in new wineskins. And in the process of doing that, sometimes destroying some of what is sacred and what is useful, you know, in an urgency to move and to respond to what I earlier referred to as these acute conditions. So what do epistemologies, in other words, what can be known and how we know what we know, what do these mean for the survival of our DNA as, and you know, as African peoples, you know, embodied peoples, but also of our cultures, our material cultures, our knowledge, and so on? What does it mean? And what does it mean, especially for younger generations, at this moment where there's both heightened Afro-revivalism and Afro-pessimism? And for me, it's most definitely a function of how long I've been around, that I often feel we risk forgetting those who have traveled before us. So I'd like us to begin in the rest of what I'm trying to do by reflecting a little bit on our journey, both out of respect for the work that has been done and also to signal for some of us what needs more paying attention to. And Sabelo, I'm going to quote you here, just from something you wrote in 2014. Critical reflection, therefore, involves not only rethinking the prospects of Pan-African unity under conditions of global coloniality, but also understanding the constitution of the present, taking stock of the sacrifices made by Africans in their struggle to defeat global imperial designs, as well as understanding the invisible and visible colonial matrices of power that continue to reproduce a particular form of African subjectivity that is characterized by deficits and lacks. And I picked this quote both because it signals work that has been done, but also because it signals an alert to us not to continuously fall into this, maybe trap is not the word, but this space where we are so buffeted that we are responding to those characterizations of what we lack. And, you know, in so doing, we often, you know, engage in these very troubled conversations about what we lack and what could be better, which is, of course, is important to do, but which is not the only thing that we can do. Many important reviews on African studies as a discipline and of programs and African studies programs have been presented, you know, over the last several years, including by people such as Jane Geyer, 1996, Paul Zeleza, 97. Zeleza has recently given us a new paper. I was looking for the title and I could not find it. Forgive me. Maybe in the chat somebody may remember. More recently, Toyin Falola and Christian Jennings have produced such a review, and Tejumola Olaniyan and James Sweet in 2010 reviewed the African diaspora and the disciplines. And as recently as 2016, James Gordon and Stephen Achampong provided a very useful overview of the history and development of African studies around the world. A particular benefit of Gordon and Achampong's work is that it documents which institutions are doing what, including offering a list of centers and institutes around the world. And then in 2021, we have a monograph by Sylvia Tamale, Decolonization and Afrofeminism, in which she argues for a decolonizing project that envisions Pan-Africanism not only as a shaking off of the imperial, but also a process of learning that embraces Afrofeminist politics into a more inclusive movement. And of course, these debates in Pan-African spaces about including the feminist and the feminine voice are also not new. The development of African studies on the continent and Black studies in the diaspora was concerned with refuting notions of Black subjectivity, that lack of the other that I just referred to. And that constituted these Euro-American constructions. The leaders of liberation, independence, and civil rights movements recognized that the modern university was a European construct. Hence the importance of an African-centered approach to knowledge production to advance Pan-Africanism and decolonization. Kwame Nkrumah's charge to the fellows of the Institute of African Studies, established at the University of Ghana in 1961, is instructive, and I will quote him here. This is a favorite quote of mine, so anyone who's been listening to me in the past few years will have heard me repeat it several times, but I think it's worth repeating. So I quote him here: "One essential function of this institute must surely be to study the history, culture, and institutions, languages, and arts of Ghana and of Africa in new African-centered ways, in entire freedom from the propositions and presuppositions of the colonial epoch, and from the distortions of those professors and lecturers who continue to make European studies of Africa the basis of this new assessment. By the work of this institute, we must reassess and assert the glories and achievements of our African past and inspire our generation and succeeding generations with a vision of a better future." So, I mean, clearly this colonial gaze still goes on, and he refers to the glorification, something that is important, but we also need to be careful about romanticizing, as we are building and as we are reclaiming. And of course, it's also important that Nkrumah at that time went on to exhort us to extend our focus beyond the continent and to include the study of the African diaspora in our work. And so he says, and I quote again, "You should not stop here. Your work must also include a study of the origins and cultures of peoples of African descent in the Americas and the Caribbean, and you should seek to maintain close relations with their scholars so that there may be cross-fertilization between Africa and those who have their roots in the African past." If you are hearing a lot of noise in the background, it's the World Cup enthusiasts who are shouting. I'm not sure who is playing and who is cheering who on. So forgive me. When Ghana gained independence in 1957, at a time when Black people in the Americas were in the throes of the civil rights movement, Nkrumah and other leaders on the continent insisted that Ghana's independence was meaningless without freedoms for Africans in the diaspora. Similar institutes with a Pan-African and decolonial agenda were established at the universities of Ibadan and the University of Nigeria in 1962 and 1963, respectively, and Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia, of course, in 1963. The Center for African Studies at the University of Cape Town, the oldest on the continent, was, of course, no news to anyone, set up with a colonial agenda to grapple with the quote-unquote native question. In other words, how to colonize more successfully. So yeah, on the continent, but a different animal altogether. W.E.B. Du Bois died at age 95 on August 27th, 1963 in Accra, Ghana, a day before the August 28th March on Washington, at which Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Not long before, having been given Ghanaian citizenship, Du Bois declared, and I quote, "I have returned so that my remains may mingle with the dust of the forefathers. Now my life will flow on the vigorous young stream of Ghanaian life, which lifts the African personality to its proper place among men, and I shall not have lived and worked in vain." Du Bois' efforts to establish the field of Black studies can be recorded as early as 1941, when he spoke at the annual conference of presidents of Negro land grant colleges. He was viewed by many African intellectuals as the father of modern Pan-Africanism. You know, we can debate this. There are obviously other fathers and many mothers as well. And his role in establishing the Pan-African Congress and his campaign to end colonialism made him an inspiration to many African leaders. Though Du Bois' life in Ghana was short, barely 2 years, it was very productive. He worked with Nkrumah on the Encyclopedia Africana, and this and other work drew radical African-American intellectuals and artists to Ghana and other parts of Africa. They included Julian Mayfield, an activist and writer who became a speechwriter and aide to President Nkrumah, the writer Maya Angelou, who taught at the University of Ghana, Bill Sutherland, who married the famous Ghanaian playwright and artist Ifo Sutherland herself, very central to this project. And of course, Du Bois' second wife, Shirley Graham Du Bois, who accompanied him to Ghana and was instrumental in the establishment of the Ghana Broadcasting Corporation. This brief narrative allows us to recognize the important role played by Blacks in the US in the development of critical African Black studies. In his presidential address at the 2014 African Studies US meetings in Indianapolis, James Pritchard reminded us that long before the establishment of formal programs in African studies at universities and colleges, indeed, by the end of the Civil War, the Negro upliftment projects had a Pan-African agenda deeply embedded in them. When Du Bois asked in The Souls of Black Folk, published 1903, what it felt like for a Black person to be a problem, quote unquote, he was articulating the potent need to forge a meaningful identity at a time when Blacks in the US had become the Negro problem. The Racial Uplift Project was the response of educated middle-class Black leaders who felt they had a major responsibility to lift up Blacks in the face of the ongoing Jim Crow onslaught on their lives, their identities, their personhood. Their efforts to provide education that would inspire and lift up led them to pursue studies of the history and culture of the African continent. And Du Bois, as well as many other academics, but also clergy and community leaders, paid attention to issues that concern the continent and linked the ways in which, in today's parlance, Black lives matter across space. And by this Black lives approach, I simply mean one that specifically addresses issues of race and oppression, what Sabelo, you yourself have referred to as a complex colonial matrix of power. And this project specifically links the experiences of people of African descent globally. So this attention to linking the lives of people of African descent globally was partly responsible for Nkrumah's studying at Lincoln University, an historically Black college, university. From the 1950s, historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs as they are called, promoted African studies. Howard, Atlanta, and Fisk, for example, offered courses on quote unquote Negro history that included African history. In 1953, Howard following that, they got a grant from the Ford Foundation and became the first HBCU to establish a formal African studies program. Recent critiques of how African studies, as opposed to African American or Black studies in the US, were created, and several people have written about this in the last decade or so, have compelled a deeper introspection and retooling of a global Black lives agenda. And if we're going to talk about our citizenship, it has to be our citizenship as a family. Just a brief word on Europe. Institutions that were established in Europe firmly followed the colonial agenda to know and conquer Africa, as evidenced by their content and the research questions they asked. African knowers and philosophers were generally not included in the sources or as teachers, for they were the subject, the other. This is what Nkrumah referred to in his 1963 speech as European Studies of Africa. The School of African and Oriental Studies, SOAS, at the University of London is perhaps the most well-known. It was established in 1916 after the so-called Oriental schools had already been established in Berlin, Paris, and Petrograd. Later in the 1940s and 50s, more institutes were set up in the former Soviet Union to counterbalance Western Europe's dominance in the field. So the Department of African Studies at St. Petersburg University was established in 1944, the Institute of Asian and African Studies at the Lomonosov Moscow State University in 1956, and the Institute of African Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences in 1959. Then there were others in Bordeaux and so on. Gordon and Achampong's work does a pretty good job of listing many of these. Although created in very different geopolitical moments, the US African Studies Association and the Africa-Europe Group for Interdisciplinary Studies, AGIS, established in 1957 and 1991, respectively, both seek to, quote unquote, understand Africa. No specific mention of African-centered knowledge or links to the diaspora are mentioned in their mission statements. Of course, in the work that they have done, there have been transformations over time, but the mission statement do not refer to this. However, the African Studies Association of Africa, established in 2013, does state clearly that its mission is to, quote, promote Africa's own specific contributions to the advancement of knowledge about the peoples and cultures of Africa and the diaspora, unquote. Space will not permit me to pay attention to African studies in Asia and the Middle East. However, suffice it to say that with the possible exception of India, most centers and institutes were established after the Cold War and have a very policy-focused orientation. A later entrant to the modern cultural export game, China has gifted Confucius centers and institutes to universities across Africa, including my University of Ghana. And our universities have accepted these uncritically with no discussion of new forms of cultural dominance. At the same time, political correctness has not attained the same status of a self-censoring guard in China that it has in Europe, and explicitly racist representations often find comfortable homes. And if we have time, we can go into some of these that are finding firm homes on social media and are also a source of huge amounts of money to people in China as the African is sold in a particular image. So a few words on citizenship and epistemic violence. When I said I wanted us to engage in a conversation, this is also because of a deep need, I feel, to address what I see as this urgency to reclaim what is ours, that is sometimes devoid of the solidarity that is so important to the work we do. Several scholars have pointed to the limitations of a human rights paradigm built on notions of equality, flagging rather African notions of personhood, humanity, and philosophies that are encapsulated in notions of Ubuntu, if you like, alternatives for ensuring our citizenship in African notions of social justice when it comes to knowledge and culture, among others. What do I mean by citizenship? That word used to have a very restrictive meaning. It was generally used as a synonym for nationality or to refer to the legal rights and duties of individuals attached to nationality under domestic laws, such as voting rights, marriage and family rights, or to the rights and duties that can only be exercised within a national territory. Those rights are acquired by birth, by marriage, or naturalization, typically. But it is in their lack of fairness that we can speak to citizenship today. So with this typical understanding, we can easily think of distinctions by sex in some jurisdictions where a man can pass on citizenship. Okay, those are my dogs having a good time with somebody coming to the house. So anyway, so typically in some jurisdictions, a man can pass on citizenship to his foreign wife and children, but women are not necessarily able to do the same. So there are 22 countries at last count where women are not able to pass on citizenship to their children. And 4 of those are in Africa: Madagascar, Sudan, Swaziland, and Guinea. And in Nigeria, foreign husbands of Nigerian women are not automatically entitled to citizenship. This is by the way, but I wanted to, just house my use of citizenship within that more standard definition. So I use citizenship here in a more socio-political sense, and I'm sure many of us do same, in which laws, policies, and practices are presented as neutral, but exclude particular groups either overtly, without shame, or more covertly and deceptively, as well as sometimes even inadvertently. When a people's knowledge is delegitimized and then erased, appropriated, or otherwise taken over without their realization, without their permission, or without the provision of compensation, then there can be financial loss. In many instances, this knowledge is sold back to the original owners at a price, creating a double loss. So you've lost your identity because your knowledge and your cultural products have been taken away. But you also lose financially from the fact that other people are making huge profits in a capitalist world out of that knowledge. questions of intellectual property arise. Knowledge producers lose access to the data that they not only gathered, but for which they also develop the collection and analytical tools. They are excluded from academic and policy publications, and they also lose in the area of reputation. And I'd like to read here something from Fanon, if I can find it. So I'm quoting Fanon here, and he says, the term cultural imperialism was used by him at a time when newly independent African states were establishing the foundations for sovereign political order. It gave radical intellectuals a lexicon by which to define language, religion, and the art fields as sites of struggle. And so let me quote Fanon now. Every colonized people, in other words, every people in whose soul an inferiority complex has been created by the death and burial of its local cultural originality, finds itself face to face with the language of the civilizing nation, that is, with the culture of the mother country. And this is Fanon, 1967. And there is a very useful book titled The Politics of Heritage in Africa that's edited by Derek Peterson, Kojo Gavois, and Shiraj Rasool. And I'm going to quote something that Derek Peterson says here. In the early 20th century, colonial states set out to order Africa, developing museum collections, conducting ethnography, and sponsoring linguistic research that uncovered the foundations of Africa's cultural life. Their work made anachronism into a source of authority, herding Africans both intellectually and politically into out-of-date regimes. The second area of this kind of violence was the creation of these heritage projects, showing how sovereign states remade the architecture of colonial governance by rebuilding the museum infrastructure. And I cite this because of the ways in which museums have been used, and we are trying to recreate museums and such these kinds of sites. And for me, I see sometimes a bit of a contradiction between the state project of building these sites of heritage in museums and many of these sites that are located outside the state projects, even outside the academy, that seem to have a much more radical voice in this kind of reclaiming. When it comes to this intellectual taking over, we see this very profoundly in the pharmaceutical world, in very, very real ways, because we feel this. The HIV/AIDS debates, the HIV/AIDS science, we had that conversation. And recently, of course, in COVID-19, the debates, the borders, the silences, the appropriations. While the warmongering on death was being peddled, death in Africa, the predictions, the prophecies, as early as April 2020, Senegal was reported to be producing a testing kit that would cost users a mere $1 at a time when testing kits were horribly expensive. And if you look for the website TechPoint Africa, you will find, and this was early in 2020, at that time, there were already scores of innovations that were being reported on this website. Just one example from Ghana, a small team of 20 young people built a comprehensive real-time tracker of COVID-19 cases across Africa. Just one example that you find on that website. Many medical procedures were carried out before they were performed in Europe. And I'm talking, going back 2-3 centuries, including vaccinations, broken bone setting, and skin grafting. Many of you may be familiar with the story of Onesimus, who was likely kidnapped from Asante, sold into slavery, brought to the Massachusetts Bay Colony by ship, and was given this name Onesimus, meaning useful, where he eventually shared his, and we can go into the details of that, the Q&A if we want to, but people can just Google it right now if they're not familiar. The contributions that he made to the development of a smallpox vaccine, sharing the knowledge that he had brought from his homeland And this, of course, being appropriated and used to, as a method of prevention with no acknowledgement of Onesimus. And as for getting any financial compensation, we can forget about that. Another example that I like to share is that of Greta Thunberg, the young environmental activist. She's famous. She's also white, and she's not poor. But how many people know Kaluki Paul Mutuka, the Kenyan climate advocate and environmental defender, or Leah Namugurewa, the 15-year-old Ugandan climate activist? These young African activists have been referred to in the media as, quote, the Greta Thunbergs of their own country. I mean, or they have been said to be following in her footsteps, even in cases where they have not had any communication with her, or in cases like Mutuka, who began his public activism long before Greta Thunberg even started hers. And this process is not benign. I'm sure we are all familiar with the story of Vanessa Nakate, the young Ugandan activist who appeared at a joint press conference in Davos in 2020 with other prominent climate activists, including Greta Thunberg and some others. When the Associated Press first published a picture of the event, Nakate had been cut out completely, and what we saw were 4 white activists. Okay, enough said on that. So moving forward, our task. Crane Sudian, in the foreword to a collection of papers in a volume on Africa-centered knowledge, edited by Cooper and Morrell, 2014, asserts that we have 2 obligations. 1, to ensure the democratization of knowledge, and 2, to constantly nurture a self-awareness of the impact of our work beyond our social, religious, ethnic, national, and cultural context. We need to think about what is happening with our work. What is it doing for whom? The obligation here, he argues, is to explain ourselves to one another and provide what he terms, and I'm quoting him here, civilizational procedures for how to deal with ourselves in each other's presence. And I'll return to this notion before I conclude. So let me just mention in no specific order, a little bit cobbled together, some of the things that I'm proposing might help us to expand on the work that we are doing and do this art of reclaiming our citizenship when it comes to knowledge and products. The first thing that I'm mentioning is gatherings, physical gatherings, online gatherings, if we can't meet in person, but physical gatherings. The physical gatherings are symbolic, but also action-oriented. I'm going to take a pause because a plane is flying overhead. So the physical gatherings are symbolic. We are meeting. It's important to us. It's important for our soul, but they're also action-oriented. And the establishment of the African Studies Association of Africa, I think, is very important in that regard. When we had our 2017 conference in Nairobi, because we meet in different countries, at the end, some of us were receiving emails and even people mentioning things to us in person. It was as if, especially for the younger people, it was as if they had never attended a conference before. And yet, of course, many of them had, but they found a certain soul connection, both around the issues that were being discussed, not that they were not discussed in other sites, they were, of course, how they were discussed, who they were discussing them with, and the opportunity for some people just to cry in the presence of others, and where they didn't have to do cultural and linguistic translation. It's like people got them. Anyway, I'm doing, as you can see, PR for the ASA. Next year, we will hold our 5th biennial conference together with the 6th International Congress of African and Diaspora Studies, most likely at the Center for Research and Training, together with the New Horizons University in Lubumbashi in the DRC, on the theme, restitution, reparation, and repatriation of Africa's immaterial heritage and cultural artifacts. That theme is set. Lubumbashi is most likely. The concept note states, and I'm quoting here, the Democratic Republic of Congo is a highly symbolic place in Africa. Given its exceptional colonial history made up of unspeakable physical brutality and the many forms of colonial epistemological violence survival today, not to mention its current history of neoliberal turmoil with involvement of several African, Western, and global predators. A meaningful scholarly reflection on neocolonialism, Pan-Africanism, and post-colonialism should start from a place like the DRC, unquote. The urgency of the questions of historical, environmental, and transgenerational justice require certainly that African and Africanist thinkers address in a multidisciplinary and uncompromising manner the burning issues of reparation, restitution, repatriation, and circulation of African knowledges, spiritualities, works of art, but more specifically, the erasure and confiscation of Africa's cultural and intangible heritage that was snatched away during the colonial period. There have been many, well, not many, some recent returns, probably most famous, the Benin bronzes. Very recently also, the DRC has seen a symbolic restitution of the tooth of Pan-Africanist and nationalist political leader, Prime Minister Emery Patrice Lumumba, who was assassinated in a conspiracy hatched by a consortium of Western neocolonialists in the aftermath of the independence of African countries. We know about this. So we need to confront theories with the paradoxical realities of the continent, our continent, especially in the area of mining in this particular instance, a huge dilemma and burden for Africa. The strong Chinese presence, so decried by post-colonial thinkers, is something that in terms of resource exploitation, not in terms of China, in terms of resource exploitation and the way the extractivism, the shipping out, the financial losses, but also the environmental crisis, is something that we are having to return to seriously today. In my country, Ghana, water bodies are under very serious threats, and both traditional leaders and elected political officers, and of course, ordinary citizens are all implicated in this process. The dialogue on the restitution of Africa's cultural heritage must continue with high energy. The restitution of human remains is also something that we need to talk about a lot more. Of course, the most famous has been the Sarah Baartman project, but there are so many human remains scattered around the world where for many peoples, a return and an opportunity to have these rites of passage to send the ancestors home properly is extremely important. And also, of course, the dialogues around the question of the restitution of works obtained and withheld through unethical means by way of colonialist collectors. The Institute of African Studies has a collection of gold weights made of, this is brass objects that were used to weigh gold that one of our former chancellors had to buy back from a collector in Germany and donate to the university. The ASA's 2023 Congress the importance is heightened by the fact that at the same time, it is hosting one of 3 sites that is celebrating the International Congress of African and African Diaspora Studies. It will dedicate an entire day during the ASA next year to discuss and reinvigorate the extraordinary transformational movement in African studies globally that began at the first International Congress of African Studies held in Ghana in 1962, and there were subsequent ones in Dakar, Addis Ababa, Kinshasa, and Ibadan in 85, but none since then. So this International Congress will open with at an Aswad conference to be held in Ghana in August of next year. It will relocate to the DRC during the AASA conference in October, and it will conclude in San Francisco in the US in November also of next year. These 3 symbolic places highlight both the painful history of the African diaspora movement during the slave trade and the homes of Pan-African leaders such as Nkrumah, Lumumba, and so on. So I just want to make a small side note here because I might not have the chance to get back to it, that at the same time in this moment, we are seeing a burgeoning capitalist market in African heritage products, art, music, medicine, crafts, return trips. Ghana has engaged in this return movement, and there are a whole variety of brokers involved in this project, which is pretty much a capitalist project that is not necessarily engaged with the issues that we are talking about today. So I've talked one about collective meeting together. We need to, number two, we need to define our debates. The debates about the past, the debates about reclaiming, the debates about archiving, but also debates about the future. I just got back from Philadelphia yesterday, and whilst I was there, I went to watch Black Panther, the second one. I know there are going to be a slew of intellectual and academic papers that will look at Wakanda and, you know, what it means and what it doesn't mean. What I want to say here about projects like that is an opportunity for us to engage, use these as entry points for engagement in discussions about scientific creations. So I was listening to a podcast on vibranium, and the producers of the podcast were linking this to scientific projects and also resources in Africa, mainly in Africa, but in other places, you know, that have been used in very specific ways, but of course have been appropriated. So of course, we know, those of us who have watched Black Panther would know that vibranium can heal, but it also can be used forever, can be used as a weapon, I'm sorry. So if Wakanda is to exist forever, and we are going to engage in Afrofutures, we can use these conversations about Afrofutures. Another aeroplane. We can use these conversations about Afrofutures and specifically science fiction as entry points into resurfacing the scientific productions of the past. Some of what I'll subsequently say will be linked to this point about debates and reclaiming. Then the formats and types of our dissemination. Archives, blogs, films, podcasts, biography, science fiction, I have referred to that, as well as traditional journal outlets. I want to give a couple of examples within these kinds of bodies of work, Ghanaian examples. So there's a project in Ghana called Literary Initiatives. For those of you familiar with Ghana, unlike many other or some other African countries, we are firmly wedded to the colonial language of English. We have not made any attempts, let me say, let alone progress, in trying to use our mother tongue as formal, official medium of exchange. The Right Ghana Literary Initiatives hosted the first Ghanaian Languages Literature Festival in 2019. And this was aimed at increasing the visibility of literature written in Ghanaian languages in mainstream society. Nikita Dede Ajiako's Short Story Prize, a literary prize she instituted this prize to discover and celebrate literature written in indigenous Ghanaian languages. Again, this is a method of reclaiming, reposting, reasserting, repositioning. I will do some little bit of self-promotion here. Myself and a colleague, Kate Skinner, at the University of Birmingham, engaged in a project that we've titled An Archive of Activism. This is an archive of gender and public history in post-colonial Ghana that seeks to constitute a publicly accessible archive on gender activism and post-colonial women. So, you know, there's a archival material, there are interviews, and there are photographs, there are videos going to be publicly accessible next year. And there's also a film which includes women that we interviewed who have been activists or came of age as activists from the 1970s as a contribution to the feminist work of resituating knowledge. Then there's a project called the Accra Archive Project, led by a young woman called Kukwa Manfo. And this project has digitized a collection, Kukwa is an architect, has digitized a collection of endangered historical material pertaining to architecture, construction, and urbanism in Ghana. The materials in this collection date from the early 1900s and are among the earliest official records of architecture construction, and contact with colonial city planning authorities available to us in Ghana. And this allows me to make the point that we need to decode our museums and our galleries. As I said earlier, there's this disconnect or disjuncture, sometimes even a conflict between the state project of museum building and what private entities have done. I'm going to cite just two collections in Ghana. The Savannah Center for Contemporary Art, located in Tamale in northern Ghana, and it also the Red Clay. So this is joint. The Savannah Center for Contemporary Art and Red Clay are two sites in northern Ghana that are owned by Ibrahim Mahama and colleague artists, and that provide a space for collections, exhibitions, cultural repositories, residencies, debates, and discourse that is meant to dismantle some of these earlier understandings of our societies. And I'd just like to, cite one of their projects, which is called the Parliament of Ghosts. So I was recently in Tamale, and I was a part of a group who were able to visit Red Clay. It has what they call the Parliament of Ghosts, is an important structure taking the form of a parliamentary chamber. And you sit there and you have these seats. For the artist in this place, it presents us past, present, and future. But interestingly, what Mahama and colleagues have done is, this is I don't know what word I should use, a mobile site, so it's not fixed. When we went, we were able to sit there, but we saw pictures of when it has been filled with water. Children from the community can come and swim there. There have been times when it has been planted with corn. And the interesting thing about Red Clay and about the Savannah Center is it's located in the community. It's open. It's you don't have to pay. And it has a direct link to the community. People do not come in there and see the the artwork encased. They can touch, they can feel, they can smell. Enough said about that. The other location that I want to talk about is a mobile museum created by Kwame Akoto-Bamfo, also outside of Accra. And both of these locations, unlike a lot of what happens in Ghana, where things are centered in the capital in Accra, and where you are likely to get, the visitors and the money, these two artists, among many others, have deliberately taken their work into the communities. Akoto-Bamfo's most famous collection is of African heads. This is an installation with the name Nchinchim, which can be translated as Nchinchim, twisting, turning, but also adaptability. And as he himself says, life's journey is twisted. The work features a compelling display of 1,500 concrete life-size heads. The goal is for this to grow, and 3,000 terracotta miniature sculpted heads that represent captive Africans who were abducted, sold, and forcibly trafficked during the transatlantic slave trade and enslaved in the Americas. Akoto-Bamfo captures the captives' shock, horror, anger, distress, fear, and pain, emotions communicated through their facial expressions in a large-scale installation that is disturbingly evocative and profoundly haunting. And he employs the notions of Akan funerary tradition. Akan are an ethnic group in Ghana that have very particular traditions for the dead. And Akoto-Bamfo draws on the Akan belief in the commemoration and remembrance after death to honor those who are likely to go on to become ancestors. And they are permanently exhibited in this museum, but have also moved to other parts of the country and around the world. Something else I want to bring to the table in this area of formats and dissemination is a question to you all about flipping the script. This is something that is not new to us, and I have recently been in conversation with a number of people about. This is about us doing research on and in Europe, the former empire. We may be stymied by money, as well as our perceived need to address the issues in our own societies that require understanding. It's like studying Europe merely for the sake of flipping the script seems wasteful. But it is important for us to bring our insights of European societies to the table from our perspective. Next point I want to make is about valorizing methodologies and even fieldwork practice. Again, not new to any of you in the room. The questions asked, how they are asked, the questions that are not asked, translation of concepts and language, and how we interpret and present our findings and where we do that. Again, a very political act. This, harkens back to the point I made about where we are disseminating our work. Is it only in the hallowed corridors of academic publications, which, let's be honest, how many people are actually reading? Next point, how does our work impact policy and people's lives? Creating sites for structural violence, disassembling sites where structural violence of knowledge has occurred should not happen by us merely reifying the local, right? What was it Nkrumah said about glorifying? We can't. Some of that has to happen because we need it for our soul and for our psyche, but we also need to be critical and we need to reinterpret these quote unquote local perspectives as knowledge, through our eyes, and knowledge that has been created about us, not only presenting new knowledge, but tearing it apart in very clear ways for us to understand how these constructions came about and what we can also do about them. And I'll be concluding soon. And so last but not least, and when I say last, there are obviously so many other things that we could talk about, but I want to talk about epistemologies of care. There's a lot of pain, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of frustration. And these are very real emotions and sometimes extremely justified. But there's also a lot of unkindness and cruelty, and we cannot do the work that we are doing in that context. We do not need to do epistemological and methodological battles and go to war with each other about whose decolonial is more righteous than the next person's. In the last talk, Godwin Murungas, he made reference to a problematic article in an African Studies journal in the name of autoethnography. Time and confidentiality will not allow me to mention a lot of the work that went into correcting that. But in the midst of the legitimate concerns, there was also a lot of cruelty. And one person called out an African brother as a quote unquote coon publicly on Twitter. For those who do not know, coon is an extremely offensive slur for a Black person. It's rooted in the racist history of blackface and comes from a shortening of raccoon, the animal. There's too much suffering, too much inequality for us to drag each other publicly. Please note, I'm not saying we should not be corrected. I'm not saying we shouldn't be called out. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be criticism. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be plain about what we object to. But I'm saying that there are ways of doing this that can be moments of learning or moments of destruction. We want to work as allies in solidarity with each other. How can we think about the common good and serving each other in ways that are not patronizing, paternalistic, or colonial? How can we enact justice in the face of the severe economic, social, and political inequalities that many of our peoples are experiencing? Who will we collaborate with and who will we refuse to collaborate with? What are we willing to risk for solidarity work? Some people are risking being canceled because they dare to speak out in the name of the freedoms of some people. Anytime we experience an inconvenience, a loss, can we walk in the shoes of others? Can we advocate for each other around COVID, migration, visas, and of course, the usual reparations, repatriations, and restitution? The epistemology of care consists of the philosophical approach in an art which includes strategies enriched with feeling and offer, gifting to each other, humanity. As well as the determination of knowledge, it includes the establishment of criteria for the evaluation of actions which materialize, having as a final purpose the alleviation of the pain and trauma of our loss, and moving towards this holistic space where we can each find safety, acknowledgement, survival, and of course, the fruits of our labor. Without receiving and offering grace, we cannot be human. And for me, grace is that understanding that I can only be well if you are well. That today has been popularized with references to Ubuntu from that Zulu word, or citing the accounts from my native Ghana. When we say Benkum Jari Nifa, Nifa Jari Benkum, literally the left hand washes the right and the right washes the left. It's not necessarily only about reciprocity, which it is about, but it also calls us to remember our interconnectedness, both at the instrumental or practical level. I need you today to help me put out the fire in my house. Tomorrow, I will help you put out the fire in your house. But the proverb also, or the saying also reminds us that what we share with each other, despite our diversity, is our humanity. It says that we come with different strengths, gifts, opportunities, as well as disadvantages and struggles. Some of these are divinely endowed, others are a result of our privilege, the head start we had in life, or alternatively, the deliberate or inadvertent actions of others to disadvantage us, or simply the fact that the world is not fair. And our journeys are different. I may be at point 7 of my journey, you may be at point 9. Be patient with me, and I will be patient with the one who is at point 2. In our Kan cosmology, while there's an emphasis on hard work, productivity, and progress, there's also a recognition that times change, and one's fortunes are not guaranteed. I will conclude, please, with the words of the Ghanaian feminist theologian, Mercy Amba Oduyoye, and I quote her. We challenge each other, therefore, to seek a new community of men and women engaged in the theology of relationships that would bring us closer to human life as God desires it. Or if we don't believe in a God, at least we know in our hearts, and I'm not quoting her now, I'm saying this, we know in our hearts how life should be lived and how we want to live it. In all of this, let us not take ourselves too seriously. We are all but a tiny dot in this universe. When we look on social media, there are just too many people who have taken, in Ghana, we may have a saying that you have taken things World Cup. In other words, every agenda that you have is a World Cup. Not everything can be a World Cup. Sometimes it's a local match. Let us mind, there's no need to win a theoretical or methodological or epistemological war, only to find that those we claim to be fighting for are dead or maimed. On this path, some will walk with us, some will not. Others will change course. That is also okay, because times change, but we need each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I shift to my brother Bongani to take us. Thank you so much for the concluding remarks on the epistemologies of the care. I think it's very, very important for the work which we do.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Phil. This has been an amazing talk. I mean, a wonderful talk. Colleagues, we have the opportunity to engage with Professor Atomako and Prof. Questions, comments. The floor is open for those. You can either write on the chat or just ask questions. Perhaps I should start with you, Christine, and welcome once again.
Hello, thank you so much, Prof, for this very insightful and provoking talk here. I was enjoying myself here in the back, and I do have a question as regards, training a critical epistemic research lens onto Europe as well. And here I'm also talking about somebody, talking as somebody who's also kind of involved in Black studies in Germany. I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on African scholars and colleagues from the continent perhaps training a critical gaze onto Black studies in Germany? I mean, Black studies in Germany has its influences from Black studies in the US. We have one key figure, Audre Lorde, who came to Germany in the 80s, in the mid 80s, and quite a sizable cadre of Black feminist scholars and academic activists and social activists have been built around the work that she has done here. And yet it's interesting also to see in connection with that, who has definitional authority in defining what African studies is and what African studies should include. I ask this because being situated in a research community in Germany as part of a transcontinental research community, I'm just wondering about how we can also talk about the types of reflexivity that is also necessary when we consider the field of Black studies in Germany itself. So I was just wondering if you could share some thoughts on that. Thank you.
Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I'm hoping that others, as I said, I was looking forward to a conversation. So I'm hoping that others will also chip in on this. So this is my 2 pesos worth, or maybe 4 pesos. Let me start it from this angle. I think it was in June, I was at the German, I was invited to, as a keynote speaker at the German African Studies Association meetings held in Freiburg. This was my first time attending them. And I had a deja vu moment. When I was a graduate student in the US, and I started attending the US African Studies meetings, I used to wonder, there are so many Africans here. Africans who are faculty, who have come to the US maybe as undergraduates, or they came as faculty, and then those from the continent attending the conference. I'm looking around, where are the African Americans, you know, and the 3rd or 4th generation Africans who can make direct links back to Africa. They were not there. It took me a while to understand the history of the African Studies Association and why that had happened, and the moments when African Americans walked out, and Herskovits, and now, you know, Herskovits has fallen. And so, you know, so attending the meetings in Freiburg this year, it was like, oh, okay, I'm having the same space. I was seeing Africans from the continent, more recent, you know, migrants, and I put it in parentheses because, again, that word has been employed in very different ways. But it's like the Afro-Germans were not at the table, and I was asking myself where they were. I did not feel competent to speak on their absence, not having been, certainly not having researched it sufficiently, and that not being part of my own history. But again, you asked about the importance of examining these issues. I am going to be in Germany next year on a professorship, and one of the things that I have put on my agenda is something that I want to explore. And I think that for me, as somebody situated on the continent, I will have a certain perspective and understanding about this, that, you know, people who have been born and raised and been part of, you know, who are Germans going back centuries or going back a few years, have a different experience. So yes, it's something that I think we should turn the lens on. You know, the same way that we have turned that lens on similar, you know, occurrences in the US, but also because of the Solidarity Project. It was at a conference I was at earlier this year. I forget where it was. And Angela Davis was one of the speakers. I was really looking forward to meeting her in person, but she came on Zoom. Anyways, she was talking about the way she emphasized the importance of the Solidarity Project, and you know, the dangers of our various suffering Olympics, or what in Ghana we would say, you know, our different World Cup projects. Everybody is on their own World Cup project. We have to work in solidarity with each other. I think that the last few years have shown us that if nothing else, if we do not join hands, we are going to be decimated in you know, in more ways than one, not just about knowledge, but, you know, financially, and actually, you know, our lives are in danger when it comes to, you know, the environment. Some people don't even have water to drink. This is work. I'm not what's the word? I'm not suggesting a racial project, quote unquote, but I am talking about an intellectual, cultural, activist project where we are joining hands based on our common history. And of course, we can decide how far that common we want to cast the net. But for me, I think that this is extremely important in doing work together, bringing each other to the table, recognizing that we have to have conversations across difference. As somebody has said, there's too much inequality and pain in the world for me to focus on my feminist issues. And then the other one is focusing on disability. And where there's a clash, we focus on the clash and not the areas where we can intersect, where we are dealing with issues of the lives of queer people, where we are dealing with the issues of, older Black women. I mean, there are so many points of intersection, and I can go back home and work on my area of importance and expertise, because I do not have expertise in all of these areas, but I can join hands with others in their political project I don't have to have all the full knowledge to join you in your political project, but I cannot, and we shouldn't demand of everybody to have the same level of knowledge and engagement intellectually. We have only, 24 hours in a day, 7 days in a week, 52 weeks in a year, and so on. So I know that I'm beginning to meander. That's my long answer of saying, yes, I think that this is important work for us to do in order to understand each other and work together.
Thanks, Prof. It's also important in this, against what you have said, basically, in the frame of what you've said, that this idea of who has definitional authority and in including these particular perspectives, which have yet to be addressed in order to sort of like, have a more robust African studies, as you said, engaging with African scholarship across space. Right. So this was one particular reflection. I'm very, very glad you shared your thoughts on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other comments, questions, comments?
I have a comment here from, I just wanted to ask you, Prof, about.
Hey, you said comment, now you said question.
Well, it's a bit, I wanted you to
go ahead. I'm just teasing you. Go ahead.
You said something about Afro-pessimism and a revival of attention at the same time. And you spoke about this together, that there seems to be an increase in Afro-pessimism as well as a revival. And I wondered if you could say more about that, something about that. And I also wanted you to hope you could say something more about cancel culture.
Okay, you are determined to get me into trouble. The first one is a little less dangerous, but let me try. Let me situate my answer in where I'm sitting in Ghana. So we have, we're in an economic decline, as in many countries. This is not peculiar to us. But we feel, and we are also heralded at the same time as the Black Star of Africa. People, whenever I'm outside Ghana, everybody thinks Ghana is wonderful. And then, I'm tempted to list all the things that are not going well in my country. So there is this, and our government has been very good at this, at selling the return project. It started in 2019 with a year of return. And then there was going to be beyond the return, but COVID came. And so we are, we have always been, we're not the most popular tourist destination, but we are a very popular return destination, right? For people who are the back to my roots kind of movement. And this is important. I mean, there's a history to this, but at the same time that there's a lot of euphoria around this. And, we cannot, what's the word I want? We cannot deny people the spiritual revival or restoration that they feel in returning to Ghana or coming to Ghana, and how important that is for them. At the same time, it's a very capitalist project in many ways. So, Accra has become a party destination at Christmas. There are the concerts, the clubs are just overflowing. There are all kinds of things that are happening. There is some pessimism for many younger people, one around their inability to participate in all of this. They don't have the money in their pockets to participate in all the, all the jamming that's going on. But also sometimes the disconnect between, those who are returning. And as I said, we cannot deny people their, and should not deny people their spiritual revival, awakening. But sometimes a lack of nuance or a failure to understand the extreme hardship that, people in Ghana are facing. And that sometimes if you're coming, from the US, you're African-American, you're coming from the US, you're also coming with a certain level of capital that allows you to benefit from the depreciating CD. You came last year and you changed the dollar and you got 5 CDs. You come this year and you change a dollar, you got 13 CDs. It's good for you, right? It can take you much further. It's bad for us because now our equivalent of the CD is not, is not taking us that far. So you have especially, I don't know if it's about, especially among younger people, because there is no survey evidence of this, but, a lot of despondency about how they are going to make it. And, they're also reading and buying into some of the narratives that are not necessarily factual about, Africans are dying from COVID, those kinds of narratives we had at the beginning of COVID that didn't necessarily materialize. And people having to make sense of these, these two kinds of narratives, whilst you've got a lot of creativity and innovation going on. And then, people are writing about all these revivals in art and culture and, music and dance, that's where a lot of the discourse, the Pan-Africanist discourse is actually taking place, a lot of it outside the academy. So these two things are happening simultaneously. If you are an intellectual, you are aware of, this, parallel or conflicting narratives. If you are the quote unquote ordinary person on the street, you are not necessarily making that kind of sense of what is going on. You're looking at your pockets and how you are struggling. And for those of us who write and work around these things, it's important for us to, what's the word I want? Not dismantle, to kind of pick at them, pick at the different fabrics, the different colors in the fabric, and show where, if you pull this strand, the weave will unravel. So you're looking at a nice, I'm wearing a piece of kente with, nicely woven. If you pick at one thread, my entire jacket might, come apart. But if you have the right creativity and the right colors, you can put it back together. And I'll let others speak to that, because I'm sure there are very many competent people in the room. The issue of cancel culture, we are, as I said, we are living in a moment, there's a lot of trauma, there's a lot of pain. There's a lot of very legitimate criticism about the ways in which, let me focus on scholars and academics, the ways in which we are doing things or not doing things, what we have written about, what we have not written about, a methodology we have used or we have not used, a word we might have used in the classroom yesterday. One of my daughters was telling me about a word somebody had used in her graduate screenwriting class, and I was like, oh my God, what happened, right? So legitimately, there's a lot of that going on. But life is not linear. It is not straightforward. It is complex. It is unfair. People are also at different stages on a journey. There are opportunities for learning. There are opportunities there should be opportunities for people to say, you know what, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. But it seems to me that there is a heightened level of impatience and intolerance with, there's a certain righteousness, and I'm sure that as a young person, I very much was walking around with my righteous armor. But because of social media, there isn't enough space and time to engage with somebody. Akosua, I heard you on this lecture today at, between University of Bayreuth and Johannesburg, and you said blah, blah, blah. Now it's in social media. This is what Akosua said. It's a snippet. There isn't the opportunity to ask me, what did you mean? Might you have meant this? You left this person out. You didn't say this, and you are cancelled. And we need opportunities to engage. People also need to be given opportunities to correct their mistakes, to be given an opportunity to even recognize that what they said was inappropriate, was wrong, was not even factual. And I'm not by any means saying that some people are not deliberately misbehaving. There are people like that, but we also know people's reputations, people's scholarship, and I guess what I'm saying in response to cancel culture is sometimes one is too swift to remove a person and to remove them, with all their work. I might be saying something that is controversial here, but it's an example that I sometimes give. What is my colleague's name? Anyway, a brother did, because I can't remember all the details, I'm just going to give the house of the story. A brother did a talk under the title of a colonialist, who today we would consider to be, somebody who should be removed, right? And at the time, there was controversy about whether he should go and give a talk under this name. Like, would one go and give a talk under the banner of Herskovits, right? And his point at the time was that even this person is his ancestor. So when we look into our families, we've got good people and we've got bad people, right? We may not be embracing the people who are the bad people, but they form part of our trajectory. For good or for ill, they form part of our trajectory. And we cannot sweep that trajectory away. This is his argument. And so therefore, he used this platform to speak about the ills and the problematic around this individual, whilst at the same time also putting forth his own agenda. And this is some years ago. I suppose that today, if he attempted to do this, he might have been cancelled. But he did have some very important things to say about racism and decolonialism and knowledge production and so on. And we will not all, obviously, we're not all going to, agree on everything. We can't possibly agree. But without recognizing each humanity and giving people an opportunity to speak and to travel a journey with us. I mean, will we only work with people who 100% share our points of view? It will be impossible. Even in my immediate family, we are in disagreement with each other, sometimes on issues where fundamentally we have, similar views about gender, about race, about, LGBTQ lives. We fundamentally agree, but there are some areas of disagreement. And with time and conversations, we've been able to come closer together. But if I'm cancelled, then I don't have the opportunity, to travel that journey with you and to learn.
Thank you, Professor Adams.
Did you call me? I'm not sure. Okay. Yes. Hello, my sister Akosua. It's so good to
see you
and hear once again your your insights that are for me so far-reaching and always right up to the current minute. I want to go back to the question about African pessimism from the perspective of the films Black Panther. I have seen the one, I saw it reluctantly, the first one. I haven't seen the second one yet, but you as an anthropologist need to see it. And I want to ask whether this kind of romanticism of African futurism is any better than Afro pessimism. When the first Black Panther film first came out, when it first came out, I was adamantly refusing to go to see it because I said, well, superheroes don't interest me anyway, and so African superheroes I can't find any use for. And so I waited until I could see it for free or almost free on TV on one of the streaming networks. And I saw it, and my opinion didn't change, but it at least was informed. So I don't know if I need to see the second one, but and I am sure that a film like that has different resonances with a diaspora audience, a continental African audience, and diaspora even in Europe or European audience. And so I was very happy to hear you draw some positiveness out of it in terms of science and potentials and so forth. But what do you think about this this romanticization of an African hero, whether in the present time or the future time? Is this, is there a positive takeaway from that?
Okay, by way of confession, let me say I enjoyed both movies as a form of entertainment, right? I love the cinematography, the color, the production was put together well, the music, the dance. I enjoyed the pop culture product that it was. And there are people in this room who may have watched neither, so I have to be careful so I don't do spoiler alerts. But yes, so there's a certain romanticism, but at the same maybe first thing I'll say is that sometimes we just need some heroes, in as much as they are unrealistic, and superheroes are unrealistic anyway. Whatever Marvel is producing, those characters don't occur in real life, right? We all know that. So so that's science fiction, that's movies, that's whatever. And we read as children, we read these stories with heroes and heroines in them. It gives us some feel-good vibe, and I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. But also T'Challa is not a perfect product, right? T'Challa and his father together with his cousin, whose name I'm blanking out on right now, are all flawed characters. Even T'Challa with his, I just love Chadwick Boseman, so that in itself, but they are flawed characters, and we do see that. So I read, a few of the reviews and response pieces that range from the highly celebratory to the extremely critical and everything in between. And, you know, I believe that Killmonger, okay, thanks, Ebenezer has put in the chat there, his cousin Killmonger, who, you know, is really introducing him allows us to see the challenges between the Black communities, you know, the Black community in, you know, in the US and this Wakanda and what they are doing. They are protecting their vibranium and they are going to be kind to the world and so on. So it's a more complicated story than, you know, than one sees at first, you know, at first glance. And I think the, you know, the second one allows us to continue with that exploration. But, you know, I will say that as a pop culture product where we need, you know, young people need to have the feel good vibe, it does allow that. And, you know, as a young Black man, you know, originally from Ghana said to me recently, he said, you know what, sometimes I just need entertainment with people who look and sound like me, right? And that's all that I was looking for when I went to watch the film, he said to me, you know. And this was before I had watched it, so I didn't give him an opportunity to, you know, to go into much detail. Because, I mean, we are buffeted by real life that is painful. So sometimes we need to escape into, you know, into a fantasy world, you know, have an hour and a half, 2 hours of, you know, an experience where we can connect to sounds and sights that are familiar to us. And by the way, I watched it in 3D. It was just amazing, you know, and to see representations of people who are amazing actors, you know, who are quote unquote our people is also important, who might be collecting Oscars, whatever we think about that whole Oscar Academy, whether one should even participate in it, you know, is another debate. But the fact that they are good enough, you know, to be in that category also means, you know, something to us. But of course, that shouldn't, I mean, if you're not careful, I mean, remember Coming to America, right? If you're not careful, you will get the movie Coming to America. If you're not careful, you will get into that romantic notion about Africa. But you know, it's a work of fiction, and yeah, I mean, we don't also. I mean, Black Panther has, I think, has had much more critical engagement than any other of the Marvel movies, right? You know, I mean, Spider-Man, Superman, Batman, whoever, they are creating new ones all the time. People are not giving them as much attention. And it's like, you know, Ryan Coogler has, you know, he's a young man who's talented. He's, you know, he's done a good product. I think he deserves to be praised for it. I don't think it was a political project for him, even though if you dig deep, there are, you know, political questions, you know, that are raised, you know, in the film. So, yeah. But perhaps others in the room. I think the role of Killmonger, you know, is very important in introducing, in alerting us to the fact that this is not just a joyride. You know, there are challenges in our mutual relationships. There are challenges in global politics, and we have to think about how, you know, we engage with each other as human beings, but also how our nations engage in, you know, in the global capitalist economy. It's, you know, it's a lot more subtle than one would hope. But if it's too overt, I mean, you're going to go into the cinema and come out, you just be exhausted and annoyed, right? But you went in to have a good Saturday night.
Thank you.
I don't know, Professor Ampopo, whether you can read the question by
There's a question
Zenon.
in the chat.
Yes, Zenon in the chat. There's a question in the chat.
Is this the one from Zenon? How can
Zenon in Daisenga? Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
How can we genuinely resist against the structural violence of knowledge in universities of Africa? Oh, yes. In your understanding, is the adoption of epistemologies of Global South enough to challenge the Western epistemic domination in universities located in Africa? I'm asking this question, referring to Fanon, who advanced that violence should be cured by the same counter-violence. Yeah, very important but difficult question. And I think that our universities on the continent are different places in this project. I mean, those of you who are familiar with Ghana and in other, in universities in Ghana and other universities, maybe if you're looking at Dar es Salaam, Ibadan, University of Nairobi, University of Lagos, Nsukka, we are at different stages. And, if I can go back to Nkrumah, when Nkrumah opened, or Nkrumah's vision about the Institute of African Studies, which is where I'm located, was based off his understanding that the universities that we currently have on the continent are European constructions. I don't know any university on the continent today that is practicing the historical model of a university like we had in Timbuktu and so on. Those kinds of constructions are not what we are practicing today. We are practicing European universities that came with European disciplines, sociology, archaeology, anthropology. I mean, when I did my PhD in sociology, of course, I did not do this. My PhD was in the US, but I was introduced to European theories and ways of doing research. And this is what we have practiced and are still practicing on the continent today. So there have been, quote unquote, decolonize movements, decolonize the curriculum. Most of these have been initiated more by students than by faculty, which is not to say faculty are not part of this. So that's it's a minority that are involved in that project, right? Recently, we had a series of them, my institute, the institute where I am, some of our younger colleagues introduced a series of seminars around decolonizing the academy. And was this at the first one? I think I made a presentation at the first one, so it would be at the first one. Our vice chancellor attended. It was hybrid, so our vice chancellor attended, but most of the senior administrators did not attend, and not everyone felt comfortable being as critical as they wanted to be. Of course, the speakers were critical because we had presented ourselves, but in the Q&A, people were not necessarily as critical as some people were not as critical as one would have hoped, right? And it's a recognition of the kind of space that the academy is, the politics of promotion, if you rock the boat too much and you're not tenured, and what people will think of you, and what does radical mean. And I was very heartened that some of our most critical comments came from graduate students, maybe even a couple of undergraduate students, who seemed not to be burdened by the same level of caution or fear of disrupting the space. So while I will not say that I am pessimistic, I have to concede that it's a very, it's a long journey. It is a fraught journey because people have also made their careers around, certain theories and ways of doing things. And you are coming, to counter these and suggest that, probably some work that has been done, the questions should have been asked another way. And possibly if they were asked another way, you'd have come with different findings about African women, or about, persons with disability, or about queer lives, or whatever it is. It's the approach that you took that gave you these findings. We know that is political. So, you are tinkering with people's reputations, their careers, and they are not going to, easily cede that space. But this has always been the case. It's not new. It has always been the case since whenever these struggles began, and it will always be a site of struggle, which is not to say that therefore we should not engage in this. And people have engaged in these struggles before. Some lost their lives. I don't think that those of us who are engaged in these conversations today are risking being shot or anything like that. So we just need to continue, and also, if I may add, we need to be careful that it's not just a fad. It cannot be, okay, everybody's doing decolonial work, so let me also join the bandwagon and throw in some fun on here and there, whatever, and then I'm good to go. It needs to be seriously critical. It's a political project at the end of the day. It's a political project. So if you are not willing, if you do not genuinely have a heart, to change, this because you care about a certain demographic, then it's not going to be a sustainable project for you. And there are many people who are quote unquote just academics. For them it's a job, and it's not necessarily a project about transformation. I missed, yeah. Let me see.
I think we are good, maybe moving towards, and I don't know whether Sabelo have a few things to say before we conclude. You are muted. You're muted.
What is happening? If there are no more questions, I think Prof has offered us a lot to think about, and we cannot keep here longer than this. Thank you so much for this delivery and the generosity with which you delivered it. We took really a lot which we will think about from now on. And thank you for all who attended, and thank you, Wongani, for chairing the Q&A. We will see you in the new year. We continue with these conversations, which are very, very important, where we unlearn and we relearn some of the things, and we try to help each other to do things differently and to even do academia in a different way. Thank you so much from my side, and thank you so much on behalf of the University of Beirut and the University of Johannesburg. Thank you.
And maybe just to add that next year we'll be joined by a third partner, CODESRA.
Yeah.
CODESRA, that is joining as conveners of these conversations. But thank you very much, Professor Ampofo. We last saw you in South Africa. You were at the University of Pretoria a few months ago, and it's good to see you again. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Good to see you
too.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. We'll see you next year.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.